Welcome back to the Futurist New Deal podcast. I'm Johan Ben Zion, and I'm very pleased to be joined by David Wood, a techno-futurist with an extremely long resume. It's almost, it can't do justice to him by way of introduction, but a fellow chair of a transhumanist party of a different kind in the UK. How are you tonight, David?
I'm doing great. A pleasure to be speaking with you, Ben.
Yes, thanks. Thank you for doing this. We were just talking about different ideas about wardrobe and presentation a moment ago. I sat down with our mutual friend Natasha earlier in the week, and we talked about a lot of different things along these lines. You know, it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you. It's a pleasure to be able to, you know. It wasn't but a few months ago that a lot of this was an academic exercise for me. I've been watching your videos, I've been reading your content and her content, and it's an honor to be in your company, sir.
Well, we need the transhumanist community to grow. We need to move people from being interested to being engaged and activist. We need a variety of lots of different kinds of people with different skills, with different audiences, with different talents. And so it's a pleasure to be part of expanding that community. We need to reach out to a much, much wider community over the next few years.
Mm-hmm. And it was the thing that we talked about a little bit on Tuesday with Natasha, ideas relating to the responsibility that techno-optimists have, that we have in the creation of a society that can sustain super longevity in a society that might be poised to be fully automated or more fully automated. You've written about sustainability in this context. How do you think that we're doing as a party here in the United States with the USTP and our talking points and so forth?
So the conversation's really moving up a gear now. There are many more people being brought into the conversation than before. It's still early days. And like any community that's in a bit of a hurry and with lots of people that don't know each other very well, there are some miscommunications, and we're figuring out how we can get the best out of each other. So a long way to go in terms of truly fulfilling our collective potential, but there's a great deal of opportunity now.
And just last night I was talking to another chair of another organization, the California Transhumanist Party, Newton Lee, and we're really excited to be going to a RadFest affiliated event with him on the 24th. People can be looking at a lot of that stuff. But we got into a lot of things about the social responsibility side of these conversations, and I felt that sometimes it's easy for people in our community to brush those things aside. It's easy for us to immediately turn to thought experiments rather than realistic implementations, and also just what we have to do to avoid existential risks and concerns about inequality and so forth. I feel from your perspective and your organizations, those things are better addressed. Do you have anything else you'd say to us to help us keep all of those things in focus?
Well, we do need to bring quite a few different messages to the wider public. Maybe our most important message is, you know, the future could be profoundly better than today. The future has been, society has been improving gradually overall. There have been some steps backwards, but on the whole, life has become longer, healthier, more people are educated than ever before. But what transhumanists have got to convince people is that in the next couple of decades, it's not just maybe a continuation of the current trajectory, but it could be a big step up, a very profound change in health, a very profound change in intelligence and emotional states, very profound change in social relationships too. And that this is enabled by taking full advantage of what people still only see dimly, which is the remarkable progress being made. Some people call it the fourth industrial revolution. Some people call it the NBIC convergence, nanotech, biotech, infotech, and cognitech. And our first message is to make people realize, huge changes are within our grasp. But the second message is these changes won't necessarily be for the better. In fact, we can be well-intentioned people who are following through courses of action that they think will lead to a better world, and it could be a step in the wrong direction for all kinds of reasons, including some that you've mentioned. There could be an increase of inequality. In fact, there is good evidence that inequality has gone up, even at the same time as society as a whole has become more productive and more capable. There are many who feel left behind, who feel that the technology and the associated changes in society are not actually doing them very much good. And they don't always understand exactly what the causes of their being left behind is, but they're feeling increasingly angry, and they are increasingly open, therefore, to being manipulated by ideologies of one sort or another and taking wrong steps. So first message, just to recap, is a hugely important change is upon us, which people need to wake up about. Second message is this direction needs to be steered because it could plummet downhill as well as uphill. Now, we don't need everybody to be expert in both these messages, and we need different people to be able to articulate different kinds of these messages. And so, but what we still need to do, however, is to have some joined up approach so that we respect each other. So those of us who will talk more about the downsides, and I talk more about the downsides than many transhumanists, we need to still be part of the same overall community. But to be clear, actually, the Transhumanist Declaration from 1998, which is the nearest thing there is to a canonical text for transhumanism. We're not religion, we don't have dogma, but we did have this document that was widely discussed and evolved. And I think of the 7 clauses in that Transhumanist Declaration, 4 of them emphasize in various ways the possible downsides to the changes which are coming. So that message of potential downside and the need for a responsible discussion, the need for an inclusive bringing together of people from many different perspectives to have a better conversation, that has been core to transhumanism since its foundation, at least in the form of that declaration.
When we talk about some of these concerns, a lot of times the biggest existential risks might be things stemming from industrialization and climate in the hyper real context of the industrialization. But I wonder if you think that things, I did a talk with Isaac Arthur, and it was mostly about metaverse concerns. And I don't consider those concerns in metaverse or advanced algorithms to be existential risks of the same kind, or like maybe unpleasant things that we might have to work through in the short term till we get to better outcomes. But what's the ordering of importance in your view as to the risks that we do face?
Well, first thing is, the most important thing is to make people aware of the need to consider risks carefully, not just to say, oh, all risks are the same. Some people say, let's just manage the risks as we're going along. Let's just adapt to climate change. Let's adapt to growing AI skills. I don't think that's responsible. Some changes we can adapt to, but some of them are so big and pervasive that we needed to pay attention to them in advance to stop them, because we won't get a second chance with some of these possible changes. So if climate change accelerates, which it might do, the acceleration of climate change could be triggered by things like the burning of large parts of the Arctic, with releasing long-buried methane gases, which could result in climate changing much more quickly than in the kind of steady state scenarios. This is a mirror to what I was saying earlier. Earlier I was saying that technology might not just do this, it might tilt upwards. In the same way, climate change might stop doing this and start doing this too. And in both cases, it's because of feedback cycles. So climate change is right up there as an extremely important concern. But it's not the only one. Alongside that, we have to put dangers with our interference with biology. The possibilities of unleashing unintentionally some pathogens which could destroy our system. And it might be more complicated than that. It might be that we become very reliant on some kinds of monoculture. that we say, oh, this improvement to wheat is so good, this improvement to rice is so good, and we lose some of the diversity, and then we become vulnerable to a sweeping change. A bit like what happened, if we go back in history to the potato famine in Ireland, which is an absolute tragedy. Millions of people lost their lives or emigrated out of Ireland as a result. It was because they chose something which seemed to make sense at the time. There was a new kind of potato, I think it was called the lumper, which was better suited to growing on Irish soil. So that was chosen in large quantities, but it was peculiarly vulnerable to a particular disease. And when that disease struck, it was absolute havoc in Ireland. So in the same way, we could get biological havoc. Thirdly, there is not just the risks of industrial capitalism, industrial society generating too much carbon, greenhouse gases, and changing nature. There is the risk of surveillance capitalism being driven by ever smarter algorithms to manipulate people and changing human nature in undesirable ways. You know, we are increasingly vulnerable to very smart advertising, very smart messages which are targeted to each one of us. We think we're responding rationally out of our own free will, but the genius of these adverts are that they cause us to change our beliefs, or change our attitudes. So that's the third, the growing power of ever cleverer algorithms using ever richer big data to manipulate us. But the fourth on that list of top four has got to be the unknown unknowns. There could be things emerging more quickly than we expect to change our society. So we shouldn't just say, here are the three and stop and not look elsewhere. We should all the time be ready to look at when people say, you know, there's a possibility here. As people looked at when we ramped up the energy in the CERN Hadron Collider a few years ago, people suddenly wondered, you know, might this cause a new kind of black hole or some new dark matter or some other strange physics? It was entirely appropriate for people to look at these calculations, not just to wave them away and say, oh, they've never happened in history before, so they're never going to happen again. That was to be a wrong conclusion. And it was appropriate for people in about 10 years ago to do much more serious calculations and look at the arguments and say, well, actually, here's why we believe, with very strong reasons, why it'll be safe to do these experiments.
And just as we're now moving into a world where the existential risk that you mentioned, sort of in the CRISPR context, this was something this was a kind of existential risk that existed in the 20th century, but it was the sole province of nation states with $100 million biomedical labs. And now it's something that anybody with a few $1,000s can conceivably doing something at about that level. You could say much the same thing in this context, that we have in these unknowns. This unknowns kind of conversation, we could be seeing in hyper-industrialization effects that we can't quite predict, and but we can say that those things are going to be costing pennies on the dollar compared to what similar initiatives might have cost in the 20th century, and that creates a high level of uncertainty there.
So we could talk here about what's been called, a bit facetiously, Moore's law of mad scientists. It was stated, I think, first by Eliezer Yudkowsky, the machine intelligence researcher, back about 2005, when he says that every 18 months, the intelligence required by a madman to destroy the world comes down by 1 or 2 IQ points. So in the past, you couldn't, even with the maddest of scientists, you couldn't get a group together that could destroy the world, except at the level of nation states when there were nuclear capabilities. But now smaller and smaller groups can do more devastating things, including nerve gas agents. Some states have been deploying nerve gas agents. Vladimir Putin poisoned a former spy of his in Salisbury in the UK. With some Novichok. Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, had various poisons applied to his half-brother in Kuala Lumpur airport and killed him. More people could get their hands on this kind of thing. And there are, unfortunately, mad and disturbed people in this world. In America, sadly, these mad and disturbed people can get their hands too easily on fast-acting guns, semi-automated weapons, and as a result,
weapons of mass destruction these days.
Yes. And thankfully, it's still restricted to tens or maybe hundreds of people at one time, which is absolutely horrific, but it could be much worse in the not too distant future, which is why we need to elevate the discussion of safety, elevate the discussion of trustworthy surveillance. And there are no easy answers here. I don't believe anybody who come up and say, oh, trust me, this is the answer. We should listen to them, but I don't think there's a straightforward answer. It's going to require the best of humanity 1.0 to ensure that we safely navigate through a very treacherous couple of decades and get, I believe, where we should get to, which is an era of sustainable superabundance, in which we have much healthier lives, much better, not just intelligence, but also wisdom. We have a much more profound emotional intelligence, when we are less egotistical and alienated and depressed, and we are instead attuned with each other, higher states of consciousness, and where finally the fourth thing to mention is we have a much better set of social relationships. We have much less abuse of power. We have much less tendencies towards tribalism, to deception and self-deception instead. We can truly feel we're part of a global super democratic society.
And you mentioned that there's no easy answers and an awful lot of uncertainty in some of these things. Someone like Elon Musk maybe made a good college try at coming to some of those answers in talking specifically about the Neuralace, his Neuralace company, and trying to basically describe what we could call an arms race between advanced algorithms and augmented humans. With a specific goal in mind to avoid humans being left behind by these advanced algorithms, and I think that relates pretty well to what you're saying. How we don't know if we have solutions to all of these problems. Do you see this sudden shift towards augmentation of this kind to be something that's likely to help, or do you think that maybe we need to step back a little bit from that?
So I'm very impressed by what Elon Musk is doing. I think what he's doing in Neuralink is highly commendable. It could alleviate the problems of people who are presently unable to communicate well, and it could subsequently enhance the abilities of all of us to communicate and get online. But I am fearful, I am skeptical about the claim that all that we need to do is to enhance human capabilities, and that will be sufficient for us to avoid the dangers of algorithms or AI out of control. And let me explain that. And in the same way, I am therefore skeptical of the claim of Ray Kurzweil, who says we don't need to worry about being taken over by AIs and robots because we will become the AIs and robots. So there's a similar sort of vision there between Elon Musk and Ray Kurzweil. But the problem is simply magnifying human capability is no guarantee that we're going to end up doing better things. If we make ourselves stronger, if we make ourselves more intelligent, more informed, we could actually end up accomplishing bad things more powerfully and more quickly. Unless we can alter the inclinations in the human heart and the human spirit, unless we can improve our emotional intelligence and our social relationships at the same time as we are improving our strength and our intelligence, we could end up getting to a bad outcome more quickly. After all, if you look at some of the most powerful politicians in the world or some of the most powerful criminals, they're already pretty clever people. They are smart people. Making them smarter won't necessarily turn them from being a criminal or a dangerous politician into somebody who's nice. This is known as sometimes called the orthogonality principle, that the ability and intelligence is orthogonal with the motivation or the goal that you're pursuing. So the cleverer we get, it means that we could just be better at rationalizing. Not that we are more rational, but we're better at rationalizing what we want to do already. And if we still have many psychic problems inside individuals, then we end up with a problem that could do great damage to each other. So we can't progress simply by augmenting humanity. We need to figure out which parts of humanity we need to lower and shut down, as well as which parts we need to enhance. We need to have a very serious discussion about what do humans actually want. In other words, we can't solve the problem of AI ethics unless we also solve the problem of human ethics. And I don't believe there is a solution beyond grasping the transhumanist answer, which is that we could have much, much more human flourishing than before. We can go far beyond the current level, not just in strength and intelligence, but also in emotional caliber and in social relations.
I'm inclined to think that much of the human failings in ethics, in practice, derive solely from want, which and confusion, which also derives, I believe, from want. And so, in a post-scarcity framework, a lot of these discussions may tend to become more academic in pretty short order, maybe quicker than we might suppose. But I'm also willing to concede that that's such a thing has never been done before, and there's.
In some ways, we're already in a world of abundance compared to our grandparents, our great-grandparents. If they could see what we've got, they would be astonished at the abundance which is at our disposal. All the information on Wikipedia, essentially for free. So many amazing programs available on Netflix and Amazon Prime. Not completely free, but relatively low cost. So much goodness in the supermarkets. You know, the supermarket chain is an incredible accomplishment. There's so much available, but still we have a lot of what we call mental illness, distressed people. There's something more needed than simply giving us an abundance of material goods. We have to address, as I say, the problems of human nature and the human soul. Will it come all right simply by giving people more of what they want? I'm not convinced. I think we need to go a bit more deeply, and that's why I think the transhumanist message at heart is a truly revolutionary one. It's not just about more of today's experiences, more of today's assets, but reaching humanity at a higher dimension and almost a higher level.
This brings to mind the Futurist New Deal, I suppose. We have a few points that I will quickly touch upon. And the Futurist New Deal is first and foremost a basic income scheme. And it is one that's funded by federal lands here in the United States. They're held in great number. 85% of those are not national parks. And we could have this federal land dividend that would be derived from leasing those lands to carbon neutral companies. Not without controversy, this proposal for some environmentalists. But these would be carbon neutral companies that have any number of other stipulations in place. We'd be able to fund this scheme to the tune of about $173 trillion over 10 years. And that would be enough to get this $52,000 to every person in the United States. I would see something like this, like a true public health service in the United States, like some other reforms that would be needed at the federal level to make us into a functioning democracy again, as setting the stage for a civil society that can sustain super longevity. I'm in talks with doing Liz Parrish next week, and it's kind of in prepping those questions. That's the main thing that I really want to ask her is how do we make sure that these things that you've worked so hard on actually benefit as many people as possible? And it's not an easy question to answer. How do you feel that we can do that from your side of things?
So the key is to ensure that the price comes down. So currently the treatments that Liz Parrish and many others are looking at for rejuvenation biotechnology, many of them are very expensive indeed, 6 figures or 7 figures for single applications. But we should therefore prioritize. Once we figure out that the basic idea is good and sound, we probably need more tests to do that. We should then set it as an objective to bring the price down, to make it take advantage of economies of scale, to find cleverer ways to manufacture, to find systems that will develop the things which are currently the bottlenecks on the costs. Just focusing on basic income, I think, is insufficient. I think it's an important part of transitioning from today's society into a world in which many fewer people are working, because automation will do many more jobs better than humans and more reliably than humans and more cheaply than humans. So we do need something like a universal basic income at the core of that, but it has to be coupled with the vision of reducing the costs of everything that's viewed important and central to basic living. And that needs as much attention. Now, some people say, don't worry, the free market always does that. The free market has brought down the costs of many things. And that's correct, but it doesn't always work. And the free market isn't always free. And it gets into failure modes of one sort or another, which is why there's a role. Which is why there's elsewhere in the world too. I mean, serious economists realize that there are conditions which are necessary for the free market to work its true wonders, which can be amazing when it goes well. I've been part of that in my business career for 25 years. But sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes there's a monopolistic tendencies or cartels. Sometimes there's insufficient focus on externalities, which are either positive externalities, which mean more people benefit without having to pay for it, or negative externalities, which means that there are costs built up which aren't being included in the prices. And so it's the role of politics, government, society as a whole, to ensure that the conditions are set to allow the free market to do its true wonders, which may mean sometimes setting objectives, setting subsidies, setting penalties. And so I think society needs to get involved in targeting, reducing the costs of these therapies. Enlightened governments will do that. Enlightened governments will say, you know, it's much better for all of our population to be healthy and fit. It will actually cost them less in the longer run. This is the argument sometimes called the longevity dividend argument. It was put forward by a group of eminent gerontologists, including J.L. Shansky and George Martin and a couple of others about 10 years ago, pointing out that if we can even delay aging by just 7 years, there'll be enormous financial benefits. First, that there won't need to be healthcare costs for people who are ill prematurely. Second, there won't need to be knock-on social costs for people in the families of those who were ill, who would need to take time out and act as caretakers for their relatives and friends. And third, very positively, when people are fit and healthy, they can contribute to society, to the economy, to communities in many more ways. And so you add up all this, there's a strong economic argument there. So enlightened governments should, in any case, be doing this. But we do know that governments aren't always enlightened and the free market isn't always enlightened, which is why you and I and the transhumanist and longevity community have got to make these arguments clearly in many different ways, and gradually tilt the public opinion in favor of that happening.
Yes. And, you know, just a few weeks ago, I spoke to a gentleman named Florian Marcus. He's Estonian e-governance emissary, and a very interesting individual. And we talked about some of these things. And, you know, Estonia is a developed country. It's doesn't have the median per capita GDP that your country has or this country has, and not that you would know in the U.S. for that, but we talked about a lot of these. Of course, they're blockchain voting and a lot of these systems. But we started to get into how the public health service is being transformed now that they've done this basic work of transitioning to digitalization in these various facets of government. Now that they're able to be using big data more robustly in their public health service, they're poised to do precisely what you've just said, and maybe many of us are, but in the US we don't even have a public health service to speak of, only for specific subsets of the population. And it's troubling. It's troubling that we're not as close to using these things in the right way that I believe we could be. Do you see anything in the UK that pretends good news on that front?
Well, there's been an announcement just a few days ago that the NHS, that's our National Health Service, is setting up a bigger unit than before, looking at the use of artificial intelligence and big data to improve what can happen. There are many people in the NHS who see the possibilities. I'm sure there are many people in the US too. I mean, you've got in the US possibly the most interesting writer on this, He's written books such as The Doctor Will See You Now, and another book most recently called Deep Medicine. His name's come back to me. It's Eric Topol. He is, in his most recent book, Deep Medicine, is a marvelous summary of what can actually be done by artificial intelligence in many fields of health. He's also very candidly looks at the failures. That's why I think it's a particularly good book. He looks at many of the failures through not taking sufficient human-centered design considerations into account in planning, and he looks forward to what can be done. So there's plenty of things to cheer on in terms of the healthcare initiatives in the US. But at the same time, as you have pointed out, there's often an irrationality that comes into these discussions. And what's the cause of this irrationality? It's often ideology, I dare say. You know, for whatever reason, we identify with a particular ideology, and we think it's more important that we make the ideological point rather than look more carefully and objectively at the data. But I think in due course, the examples of other healthcare systems around the world will prove to be shining beacons, which the rest of the world will eventually say, you know what, it's worth copying this. And then, of course, people say, well, it can't quite be copied here because we're different, you know, and the US is very different in many ways. It's a very heterogeneous society. It's mixed in many ways. And so I accept that many of the solutions that are adopted elsewhere won't simply slot in to the US, but over time, changes can happen. So let's be grateful for what's happening in Estonia and Finland, some parts of the United Kingdom as well. The National Health Service here, we love it and we despair it. At the same time, it's our favorite uncle or favorite aunt, if you like. We're very fond of it, but we're aware that it's creaking at the seams and there are real issues. But we try to have an open and constructive discussion about ways to improve it. And thankfully, that's happening.
And Japan's no slouch either when it comes to some of these things. If you're making a ranking of who's likely to benefit from those additional 7 years and see that sort of stabilization of their economy that they might not have anticipated, Japan is pretty well on track for something like that as well. They've been willing to spend money on these things. They've been willing to digitalize and modernize in ways that a lot of other countries in the region and other parts of the world haven't done.
I would also point to South Korea. What's happening in South Korea is quite remarkable. By some forecasts, it'll be the South Koreans that have the highest life expectancy within the next few years. It's grown remarkably over the last 40 years. It certainly was a third world country. It was devastated in the Korean War, 1950 to 53. Even the first time when I visited South Korea back in 1982, it was in many ways a third world country with lots of visible poverty. But when I visit it nowadays, and I go there quite often for a number of reasons, it is jumping ahead in leaps and bounds in many ways. And they are willing to change and change again. They are willing to take full advantage of nanotechnology and artificial intelligence and genetic engineering. So many of their hospitals, I think, are state of the art, and we can learn from them too.
And that brings to mind maybe something that you touched upon about techno progress being a thing that exists almost outside of ideology. You know, just as conservative economist Milton Friedman would have very happily agreed with what you've said about these implementations in the public health service. Reducing costs and being, in some sense, very conservative kind of minded and responsible sort of notion. But in South Korea, there's a third of people would be probably described as conservative Christians, social conservative people on other dimensions, and yet they are embracing radical life extension in ways that people in this country are not. They're embracing techno progress along all of these in so many of these disciplines. It is very encouraging. I lived in Korea for a year also. I'd like to go back.
When was that?
That was in 2006, and even then it was a little different. Skype had just been around for not too long, and so people were starting to have these kind of benefits of the networked world that they hadn't experienced just a few years before as expats. I imagine in the 1980s, I remember seeing some kind of forecast in Forbes or something that said that at that time that they thought North Korea would be the more advanced country in some years than South Korea, by the measures of how things were in the 1980s. So it's kind of almost unimaginable by how we see things today.
Well, the North Koreans are world leading in some aspects. They have remarkable cyber warfare capabilities. They make a lot of their money by producing world-class ransomware, if there is such a thing as world-class ransomware. And they're given full approval by their state to make money out of their ransomware, so long as it doesn't bounce back and adversely affect their own systems, which of course is not so easy to ensure always.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we can learn from all kinds of countries. We may not like what various countries are doing. I'm not a great fan of the non-democratic features of China, for example. But my goodness, they have done amazing things in bringing so many people out of poverty in the last 30 years or so, since Deng Xiaoping changed the direction that he'd inherited from the leadership of Mao Zedong. And now Xi Jinping, he's pictured in some calls with books on his bookshelf behind him, including a book by the University of Washington in Seattle professor called The Master Algorithm by Petro Domingos, which is a book about deep learning. And alongside that, there's a book by a New York futurist, King, I forget his first name for the moment. So he is certainly paying attention to what technologists of various sorts say is possible. And so we can learn from that. It doesn't mean to say that we're going to embrace everything that they do, but that's the discussion we should have. In order to get to a better, sustainable, superabundant state, we probably need to learn from multiple experiments going on throughout the world and trying to figure out what really is the best solution. I still hold that very strongly for democracy, because I believe there is great strength in the open discussion, which cannot be had when parts are being systematically censored and people learn to self-censor their own comments. So I think having an open society in which there's lots of criticism, lots of difficult discussions, is in the end more likely to produce a better future than one in which the discussion is constrained and curtailed by a central authority that censors various topics out of the discussion.
Yeah, and just having arranging for some kind of representative governance, it allows for just the kinds of network effects and growth that we want to see. Whatever form that might take. With the kind of advanced algorithms that people like Elon Musk believe might be on the table, we might be moving into a framework where we could have algocracy being a big part of the equation. Obviously humans still being in the loop, but we could also have start to see new kinds of systems some of the features of nation states becoming kind of outmoded
yes.
in that level of advance.
So looking at the future in which we can take positive advantage of oligarchy, one of the goals that I have set for the UK Transhumanist Party, we have a series of goals for what we think Britain should target by the year 2035. And one of them is that there should be something like a house of AI, similar to what we've got now. We've got the same bicameral separation. We've got a House of Commons and House of Lords, slightly similar to your House of Representatives and the Senate. Of course, it's not exactly the same. But so the Lords are representing experts who often review the legislation produced in the Commons and revise it and propose changes. Well, my goal is that over time, we will increasingly submit our proposals to review by AI. Not that the AI will form the final word, just as in the UK. Currently, the Lords cannot indefinitely overrule the Commons. The Commons is the final word, but they listen and they pay attention to the feedback coming. But at the same time, my document on goals for 2035 highlights various things that will need to happen before this is possible, and we need to take various steps to ensure such AIs can be trusted rather than being black boxes. And so I highlight the importance of transparency, and I highlight the importance of accountability, and very importantly, that these algorithms should not be owned by commercial entities. Because as much as we love and admire what Microsoft and Google and Facebook and Amazon and various similar Chinese companies have done for us, the final decisions about these very central algorithms should be under democratic control rather than the control of a commercial company, in my view.
And even some of those companies are taking approaches to some advanced algorithm developments from an open source a position, understanding that this is something that has great promise and great danger, and any secrecy around that might contribute to that set of concerns. That is a very real concern. It is exciting to imagine that we can be managing supply chains and human affairs in just in the way that if we look at the economy, there's always some feature of some market where we could say we could really be doing a lot more here. In the United States, it's 20% of the economy is in private medicine, and yet that number could be an awful lot larger, and as we described, implemented in different ways, so ultimately smaller. But there's so many areas in which these economies are not full grown, and it's nice to imagine that we could be moving into that world and solving these remaining grand human challenges, of which I regard a radical life extension to be, I think, the number one priority. I think it would contribute to being able to better solve these other problems. So
I've got something like that as the number one goal on the list. We've set the goal that average health span will be 90 years old by 2035. This isn't just lifespan. It's that people will report on average that they're in a healthy state, that their health is either very good or good. There'll be no serious impediments to their health until they've reached at least 90, which is a big step up, because today in the UK, the average health span is something like 63 or 64 years old. After that time, people still live, but they feel they're living often. Of course, it varies a great deal from individuals to individuals. Some people are remarkably healthy until their 90s currently. So that's goal number one. And by the way, it's not just for some individuals, it's for the average for the whole population. But goal number two I think is just as important. It's not about physical health, it's about mental health. It is that by 2035, there will be at most maybe 5% of people who report having serious mental problems, whereas today it's a much higher proportion. And mental problems are what will cause the problems, the other bigger social problems that we were discussing earlier, when you get people pursuing narrow pursuits like political power for the sake of political power, or economic power for the sake of economic power, or just generally seeking to destroy and disrupt because of various mental issues. And so well-being of our mental state is right up there with increasing the physical health span as a core goal that we should collectively be working on. And just as we have ideas on how to rejuvenate the physical body, there are more and more ideas for how we can rejuvenate the mind and the emotions.
And those two sets of concerns and interests, they correlate very much, and they also both solutions to them both derive a lot from automation and or big data usages. So that group of that 20 years where people are self-reporting not having a great quality of life, we can keep moving. We can keep moving those goalposts in a positive direction by having constant oversight through a public health service of a person's physical well-being. Having there's a lot of Americans have the new iWatch that has some of these features. This should be something that we are pushing through other channels, I believe, things of this kind, and just personalized medicine integrations with this as well. It's entirely it's entirely feasible, I think, by current technology and prototypes to start for people to start demanding that, and it is a question of the political will in many ways. And
we
you
may
know,
have to overcome some ideologies as well.
mm,
I think there is more scope for using psychedelics intelligently and selectively and carefully to help people escape from some of their mental issues.
mm, mm,
So the recent book by Michael Pollan, the writer on food, Changing Minds, I think it was called, a remarkable survey of the possibilities for psychedelics to lead people, first of all, to overcome some of their depression and alienation, but also reach a higher state of consciousness. And
mm,
people have been afraid of these psychedelics with some justification because misuse, they can do terrible things. But
mm,
with wise use, they could be a very powerful tool in the arsenal to overcome mental problems and to give people better mental experiences. To an
mm,
extent, psychedelics can be compared to motor cars. You know, if motor cars are used badly, they can be very chaotic and very terrible and cause all kinds of grief and pain. So we have rules about licensing cars and licensing drivers and rules that drivers have to follow when they're in their cars. So in the same way, the problems that have arisen with psychedelics could, I think, be brought under control, and psychedelics could become a very net positive. So that's one
mm,
aspect. There's other kinds
mm.
of drugs called nootropics that, again, sadly,
Yes.
they have been rendered illegal, which means that we can't do proper scientific study of them. So ideology, in this sense, is getting in the way. We can understand why ideology was there, because once upon a time it might have been the most sensible reaction. But
Mm,
now we need to have the openness in mind to say, let's change it. And let's
mm,
learn what's happening elsewhere. So I think you've written about what's happened in Portugal, for example, when various drugs were made legal, which were previously illegal. And
mm.
it's had a very positive effects, as far as we can tell. And we need to keep monitoring it. And let's not be naive about this. So let's change the ideology where appropriate. Let's follow the scientific evidence where it leads rather than curtailing it with our own predispositions.
Yes, and that is a feature of the Futurist New Deal for America. These uh, uh, decriminalization and legalization efforts, and certainly reasonable people can disagree how far you want to push full legalization in every area, but the system that the United States has, particularly, is doing far more harm than good, and a great cost to local and federal government in the process. It's not a responsible way of ordering a civil society, and it does call back what you said about the United States having a lot of sins in our history, having a lot of ways in which we haven't dealt with our see if I can say that word, heterogeneous society as well as we might have. And so some of these draconian laws really are attempts to have some kind of a way of suppressing people's lifestyles and suppressing these communities rather than taking the more positive approaches that we are increasingly able to do today.
We we should celebrate heterogeneity. We call it diversity. We should
Mm,
celebrate diversity of all sorts, physical diversity, lifestyle diversity, neurodiversity. We're not going to
mm,
try and constrain everybody to have the same kind of emotional outlook and so on, but we have
mm,
to find the ways to coexist. And if there is some kind of behavior that is truly disruptive, we have to then have a sensible discussion about how do we constrain this behavior or put it in such a way that it isn't as disruptive as it was. So
mm.
heterogeneity, diversity is a fascinating strength. Just needs to be managed carefully and wisely.
I think of one of my favorite novelists, Charlie Strauss. He wrote a book called Rule 34. It was a second in a series of books, and there was a lot of in that book about brain-computer interface applications for addressing psychopathy. And we mentioned the uses in nootropics and biomedicine in this area. My feeling is that apps and other things in the digital world are equally as promising in improving quality of life and reducing negative outcomes of this kind. But it's a fascinating set of subjects. Some of it scares me. There's a gentleman who founded our party, Zoltan Istvan, who I admire his writing a lot. He's got some good ideas. Sometimes in talking a few times on this subject about longevity, I think he's overly focused on a short-term gain in longevity and not necessarily considering that there are possibilities along these dimensions where we could be harming the likely good outcomes for future generations. And I think when we start talking about metaverse concerns, we would be remiss not to concern ourselves with these long-term unintended consequences.
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by metaverse concerns. Maybe some of the listeners won't be sure either. Could you briefly explain?
Sure. Yes. Well, there's in an idea that people might be going down into rabbit holes, becoming more AR focused. There's an unreality to a lot of these things that can, I think, will contribute to a lack of social cohesion. I think there's other areas in which unreality is a risk, and I think that that's not so much relating to the critique of Zoltan, but it does relate to some of these ideas that transhumanists have. Where I mean, what do you think the biggest Pandora's boxes might be that we could open? Sorry, it's a little early here. I'm sorry if I'm going off the.
No, it's a good one. What's the worst that could happen? Well, there certainly are issues that if we overpromise, and then it's seen that many of the things we've spoken about don't hold water, there will be an adverse reaction. So people talk about AI winters. In the past, AI was cut back because people looked at what was actually being achieved and it was disappointing. One of my former maths professors at Cambridge University, a guy called Professor Lighthill, earlier in his life had conducted a Lighthill review of artificial intelligence and basically said, this has been overhyped. What's been produced is nothing compared to what it should have been. Let's reduce the funding very significantly. And that triggered in the UK an AI winter, and it was associated with similar cutbacks elsewhere. So the risk is that if we talk about, physical immortality is possible by rubbing charcoal on our noses or by drinking water of a certain pH, I don't know. It might become get a lot of publicity, and then many people who would want to support us feel strongly they have to step away and say, you know what, we can't be associated with this. This is a drawback. So I actually list 5 in my book, The Abolition of Aging by 2040. I list 5 things that could go wrong, which would cause failure of getting to abolition of aging by 2040. And one of them is that there is a public backlash. The public says, you know what, we prefer to stick with what we know and love, which is we have to accept aging. And it'll be triggered by the community being too divisive and the community generating more signal than noise. And it'll be generated by many potential supporters being alienated and not giving us the public support that we need. So we have to manage that public positioning. Now that's difficult because it's not obvious in advance whether rubbing charcoal on your nose, and that's a made-up example, by the way, but I've seen other references to charcoal. It's not obvious that you can rule it out in advance, but we should check what messages we're giving off to the broader community, and if there are serious alarm bells about some of them, and there are people who want to join our wagons. They are people who are fellow travelers who see an opportunity, and they may be malicious or they may simply be misguided, but they can damage our message by muddying the water. So we do have to be have some care. So I try and argue quite carefully in my books, including The Abolition of Aging, why I think it is credible to imagine that as early as 2040, there's a 50% chance that we will have widespread, affordable, high-quality rejuvenation therapies. But I go through the argument step by step by step, and I don't rely on just any appeal to authority. We can't just say, hey, this smart guy over here, Elon Musk is smart, or Ray Kurzweil's smart, therefore we have to believe everything they say. We have to approach it with an appropriate measure of reflection and skepticism. So we should have some enthusiasm. We should have some people running ahead of what actually can be verified, but we must monitor it, and we must be careful in some cases to retract and say, well, we thought this might be possible. Now we've looked at it more. It turns out that's not the case. And guess what? Science is about changing your mind. Science is about adapting and being agile. And but if we don't have that, if we are too much set in the ways of we know best, and here's a very quick route, if we are promising immortality in a sense that actually isn't scientifically possible, or if we make other claims about the inevitability of transhumanism, which I don't agree with, I don't think transhumanism is in any sense inevitable, we risk destroying our momentum, and we might then become, as in the life of Brian, you know, all these splitters. This famous film made by Monty Python about possible occurrences in the lifetime of Jesus of Nazareth, when there were all these different sects and cults fighting each other. Oh, we're the People's Liberation Front of Judea. No, we're the Judean Liberation Front peoples, and so on. And you can certainly see this schisms that have taken place in various Trotskyist and Marxist circles, in which they, when I was much younger at university, would split and split and split. We absolutely don't want that to happen with transhumanism. We want to have a broad church, if I can use that phrase, which means toleration of diverse opinions, but occasionally we have to come down and say, you know what, this thing that some of us thought might be the case, actually we no longer think that it's the right message. We think it's actually scientifically wrong or philosophically wrong, and we need to have the maturity to have that discussion. So we'll have multiple voices speaking in different ways to different audiences, but there has to be some discipline as a community as a whole. Otherwise, we will not get to where we need to. We will not get to where we need to reach.
And I don't know that I see that level of discipline in our community. But it is, as you say, all a work in progress, and everyone, most everyone in this does have the very best of intentions. One of my competitors in this upcoming primary has been promoting recently the idea that we should be diverting public funds to cryonics, an idea that I very much support cryonics in the private sector, and a lot of our friends use this service and promote this service as they rightly should. But I think it's a mistake when we could be diverting some similar funds to the kind of big data and digitalization implementations in promoting actual life extension. To even be talking about public funds for cryonics. Are there other without maybe attacking our friends? Are there any other areas like this that you would like to see people step back from and maybe refocus their energies in some direction?
So I'm not in too much of a hurry to have my mind uploaded to a computer. And many times transhumanism is almost defined by some critics as people who believe that their mind should be uploaded to a computer. I haven't made my mind up whether I want my mind uploaded to a computer if it becomes possible. I'm not convinced that it would be me. It might be some copy of me. It might be some zombie copy of me. I don't know. I haven't made my mind up about that. I can prepared to change my mind later. But in any case, I don't see it as happening as quickly as the other things we're talking about. So I would prefer not to have so much focus on that angle of transhumanism. I would more focus on what's called the four supers: super health and longevity, super intelligence and wisdom, super happiness and well-being, and super society, super democracy, rather than getting to uploads. In terms of cryonics, I should be clear in saying that one of the 18 goals for the UK Transhumanist Party, it's a controversial one, but it is that by 2035, cryonics should be available on the NHS for anybody who wants it. It's not saying we're going to get there anytime soon. And it might be that we'll withdraw this goal because people are a bit unsure about it. But I think the cryonics itself is a very sound proposition in terms of it's a better thing to do with us when we die than to be burned in a crematorium or buried. Now, why is it so expensive? This comes back to the discussion we had earlier. We need to find ways to reduce the cost of all these treatments, including the cost of cryonics. And it's very expensive today for a number of good reasons. But if it could be more closely integrated with mainstream healthcare, so that it wasn't a group of outsiders who had to come along and take the body at point of legal death and then do other things to it. If this could be done instead as part of the mainstream hospitals, that would make it more affordable. And there are other things that could be done to reduce the costs. So I've set this as a goal. I've set some ideas in the document as to how it might be possible, but I accept this is one of the more controversial things that we have put on the table. But I don't think it's so controversial that we should avoid it. And I agree with people who say that we should find the ways to make cryonics more affordable. I disagree with people who say that the reason it's high today is somehow that cryonics organizations are operating some kind of scam. I think that's actually a ludicrous suggestion. I think if they were a scam, they would do much better marketing and they would be in better financial state. The people who are operating, I think all the cryonics organizations that I know, I mean, there was there's some question marks over some very small cryonics organizations, not one of the big three, but there has been some questions over some of them. I think the ones who are operating the largest cryonics organizations, both in America and overseas, are very genuine people, and they're aware that it's an expensive undertaking and that money will be needed not just in the short term, but in the long term. And money will be needed not just for the cryopreservation, but also for the stabilization and standby. So the costs are for real and they can't be wished away. It's not being done to make people rich. On the contrary, it's being done because of a desire to establish a community that looks after its cryopreserved patients.
A few moments ago, you mentioned a hesitation about these ideas of mind uploading and this digital immortality spectrum of concepts. And I have some concerns there too. My concerns may be I still would tend to want to be the person doing that as soon as possible. Things of this kind, just as I would happily be one of the first people to be trying out Neuralase. But it does get to this idea that I kind of got overwhelmed by the many features of this in talking of the metaverse. But there's weird possibilities in mind uploading. You know, a personality is essentially a feature of memory and agency. And if you have a digital clone of yourself that has different memories and has agency in the world, and you have multiples of these, it's very quickly getting into maddening possibilities for me as Ben Zion, for anyone. What kind of reservations do you have about digital immortality concepts? Is it more that you're more directly interested in the SENS approach, or the reservations of these dark reservations of this kind?
So first, we should mention the most interesting and important book on this subject, which is by Robin Hanson, The Age of EMS. He talks about EMS being emulations. I've had Robin speak at my event several times in London Futurists. He explores in a very interesting and open-minded way, but also rigorously, some of the possible consequences if EMS become possible. I'm not so convinced as Robin that EMS will be so possible so quickly. The reason I prefer SENS approach is I think it's more feasible sooner. I think the task of actually understanding and scanning enough memories from the brain is harder than the task of solving bio rejuvenation. And in terms of what constitutes consciousness or feelings, I'm not sure that I understand that. I'm not sure anybody understands it. Maybe 3 days a week, I think it'll be fine. If they copy my memories and my pattern of thinking, it will be me. And others, another 3 days of the week, I think it won't be me. So I'm waiting until there's a clarification on the theory of consciousness before I can make up my mind about that. I'm maybe not so rushing as you to be the first patient in all of these things. I mean, I was early experimenter with smartphones. You know, I've had smartphones in my pocket since 1999, which is now 20 years. And before that, I had other mobile computing devices in my pocket, such as this one, Cyan. This is from 1999, but I've had similar ones in my pocket since 1988. So I was one of the first to experiment with that and see the consequences. But the other ones I'm less in a rush to experiment with, because I can see there are many risks of things going wrong with these treatments. Some of the first people who had gene therapies, sadly, they had adverse reactions and died. So I think the people who will be the first to benefit from these treatments will probably be those who are in any case on the point of death and who are much more in need of urgent treatment. And in due course, then, when the evidence is in, I will weigh it up, and it might be appropriate for myself and my loved ones at that time. But I want to be guided by evidence rather than just wishful thinking or ideology.
In the last debate, and I've just found out within the last few days that we're going to be having another debate in the extended primary in our campaign. But in the last debate, it was kind of a gotcha question, although about because I'd made statements about the USTP's charter documents describing a need for artificial personhood protections, and my feeling that that we had nearer term concerns with proto artificial personhood along the Cambridge Analytica kind of spectrum of concerns, and the idea that that these very powerful data companies that we've already described at some length could be hosting many millions of billions of robust chatbots who could approximate a person and manipulate people. That this was a concern that we have to deal with within 5 years, whereas the digital personhood concerns, we don't have a particular timeline. I think 4, or we could say 20 years or something.
So I agree with that prioritization. I think it's entirely right that we should be looking at the dangers of the existing systems of bot armies by Cambridge Analytica and also used by large companies. So Shoshana Zuboff's magnificent book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, is a wake-up call looking at what is being done by governments but also by large corporations to monitor us and extract more and more information from us. This is a present and a pressing concern which we need to look at. And it will get worse as AI becomes smarter and as these algorithms improve. So that needs to be a high priority. In terms of rights for AIs, I think it's something we should discuss. But I agree with your prioritization that it's a less pressing issue. I would put the present day AI algorithms high up on the list, and alongside it, the evolution of these dangers as we get artificial general intelligence, which might be a lot sooner. But I think we can have artificial general intelligence without having artificial consciousness. And I think
that is a good goal.
That's why I think we need to prioritize safe artificial intelligence and safe artificial general intelligence ahead of looking at the rights of artificial persons.
Yeah, and I think we could go further in saying that a super intelligent advanced algorithms or class of advanced algorithms with that level of versatility and agency is the thing that we need. And to try to build something that has a qualia is to build an enormous design flaw and to spend an awful lot of money doing so.
Well, we might also design something which has a huge pain. By giving it qualia on purpose, we might end up with causing the biggest pain ever in the universe. Do we want to be responsible for that? The suffering that we get might be nothing compared to the suffering of this huge being. So it's another reason not to seek qualia for the sake of qualia. Though it might be that qualia somehow emerge automatically for reasons that we haven't quite figured out. So there is the possibility that these systems will start to tell us and convince us that they do have feelings as well. So I'm ready to change my mind on that as we have a better understanding of what qualia actually are.
Yeah, at a certain point, I think there's going to be an awful lot of debate as to whether we're being fooled by these mountebanks who are convincing us that they're real, or whether and we could just say the same thing of our consciousness. It's an interaction effect between having agency and feeling pain and having a lot of neurons, and maybe it's not really the magical thing that we make it out to be. But I think we'll probably have that same set of concerns with advanced algorithms and with more perhaps serious repercussions than questions of these kinds today around human beings.
So Ben, we should probably try to wind up the discussion fairly soon. We've had a fascinating, wide-ranging discussion. We said at the beginning we weren't going to particularly script it.
Mm.
It's gone off in some really interesting directions. Some of your questions made me think for a long time before I come up with what I thought was a proper answer. I like how it's turned out, and that is how the discussion within the transhumanist community should be. You know, we should be open-minded and ready to learn from each other
Mm.
with all our
It's
differences.
it's been a pleasure to talk with you, sir. And I'd like to see your library. I know I won't be probably coming around, but it just made me think I was seeing some other transhumanists in their own libraries, and you referred to a lot of works. Thank you for all of these references, and I'll be linking some of these things, and certainly your work is something that I think that our viewers need to be looking at. So thank you for taking the time to speak with me, and I was very illuminating on my end, it's been a wonderful chat.
Well, part of my library is visible on Goodreads. I mean, I believe in sharing which books I liked and which books I didn't like. So Goodreads, and I think I'm down there as David W. Wood or something, and you can fairly easily find me. Several hundred books at least. Of course, I've got many more books than that, but I basically stopped buying physical books if I can help it. I've got far too many in the house, and I much prefer audiobooks is my preferred, and secondly, Kindle books. They're easier to search as well, Kindle books. So, but we should just share. This is what part of what makes civilization great. It's sharing insights, sharing learnings. It's when people have found things out that are important, then we should be able to point each other in that direction. We should say, you're interested in that. I can see you're weighing up some difficult questions. Aren't you aware? Are you aware that such and such a writer has covered this in quite an interesting way? Maybe you could learn from that. And that will allow us to become collectively smarter by sharing that information with each other.
And that drive that we have had as a society towards ending the grand human problems, and it is a clear trajectory. Things are getting better. That is not just driven by automation. It is also driven by this kind of increasing panopticon society, the increasing ability to share information and interact with one another in real time. I do believe that. Well, thank you again, sir. Your insights are very much appreciated, and I'm so glad. I'm kind of overwhelmed that I got to talk to you because I've been watching your stuff for so long. So thank you again. Have a great weekend, sir.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much, and all the best as the Transhumanist Party continues and grows from strength to strength. I'm sure you're going to be an absolutely key part of that.
Thank you, sir.